Well, thank you so much, Ed, for those remarks, and what a jewel he is. My goodness, an endless memory. Thank you very much. And I forgot, you spent the day with my father. About what would that have been? 1983. My goodness. Well, that's not at all. Thank you so much, McSweecum, for your prayers that opened us. And by the way, McSweecum has served Canada in our uniform in the Canadian Armed Forces in Cyprus and various places around the world. So as we are just 3 days after Remembrance Day, thank you so much for your service and that of all of our veterans. Friends, it is a great privilege to be here this evening to help remember the legacy of the great Peter Lougheed and to help present awards in his honor to four truly distinguished Albertans: Elizabeth Cannon, Stockwell Day, Don Farrell, and Dave Mowat, each of whom I regard as friends, and all of them remarkable in their own right. All four of whom personify the spirit of innovation that has made Alberta one of the most prosperous and generous places on the face of the earth. Whether it was building the world's GPS network and one of our great universities, or balancing budgets and reforming taxes, or transforming one of Alberta's great energy companies against tremendous adversity, or modernizing one of our great financial institutions, the four individuals we are honoring tonight, well, they've done it all. Elizabeth, Stockwell, Don, and Dave personify that can-do, get-her-done spirit of Albertans, and on behalf of the government and people of Alberta, let me congratulate each of them on this richly deserved recognition tonight. How fitting that they are being honored with an award named after another great Albertan, the late Peter Lougheed, whose vision led to one of the greatest economic booms in Canadian history, who was a proud Albertan, but a profoundly, deeply felt Canadian patriot from a great Canadian family. His refusal to back down in defense of Alberta's just claims for control of our economic future earned him a special place in our province's history. Another late premier, Jim Prentice, a friend of many of us, a former colleague of mine, wrote a book called Triple Crown, in which he argued that Canada's challenges related to three things, he said: Indigenous reconciliation, energy, and the environment. And he argued that these things are deeply connected and can only be resolved by solving them together. And I agree with our late friend, Jim. And tonight I want to sketch out briefly three forms of reconciliation that Alberta's government is trying to undertake. First of all, reconciliation with Alberta's Indigenous people. Secondly, reconciliation of energy growth and environmental stewardship. And thirdly, reconciliation of the provincial and federal fields within our Confederation. On the first, our new government is following the path of reconciliation with Indigenous people. That is why we restored within weeks of forming office the custom of an annual meeting between Alberta's cabinet and all of Alberta's treaty chiefs. We gathered 46 of our chiefs from across the province to a remarkable day-long meeting in which we found a profound consensus, something close to unanimity, in favor of partnerships and responsible resource development. We're also renewing and seeking protocol agreements with several different First Nations groups in Alberta, including our recently signed renewed protocol agreement with the Blackfoot Confederacy that we signed on the anniversary of the treaty signing at Blackfoot Crossing. And let me add that just yesterday I was visiting one of Alberta's great cultural institutions, the Glenbow Museum, and discussing with them, as I did in England recently, an effort to repatriate the personal artifacts of Chief Crowfoot that ended up at the Exeter Museum. we're trying to bring back to the Blackfoot people here in Alberta. We are creating what I think will be a game changer in Indigenous Crown relations and our ability to get our resources to market. With the recent adoption of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, backstopped by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the Alberta Crown to facilitate Aboriginal financial participation in and co-ownership of major resource projects. And I'd like to thank, I should have began by acknowledging my boss, Your Honor. Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor, thank you for signing that into law, Your Honor, 2 weeks ago. I truly believe that it is a moral obligation of this generation of Canadians to ensure that our Indigenous people benefit materially from the responsible development of the resources that lie below the lands that their ancestors first inhabited. Alberta has already been, in one of the many ways in which we have been a great example of social mobility and progress, is through the inclusion of our Indigenous people in resource development, with by far Canada's highest levels of employment and incomes for Indigenous Canadians, thanks in large part to the progressive and visionary leadership of our resource companies. But we have only just begun. We need to move beyond contracts and benefit agreements to facilitating actual ownership stake for our First Nations, and we are determined to do that. And I believe this will be the game changer in getting in market access for our world-class resources. And it is also an area of common ground between the Alberta and the federal governments. Prime Minister Trudeau and I agree that our most important natural resources infrastructure project, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, should have, and I see Ian is here somewhere, should have, and by the way, where's Ian Anderson? Could we give him a round of applause for his remarkable work and his great leadership on this? Ian, you deserve to be singled out for your leadership. You have spent years and years of patient, deliberate work developing relationships with First Nations between here and Burnaby, between Edmonton and Burnaby, bringing communities on side to be partners in prosperity, and for your frankly courageous and relentless leadership for Canadian prosperity, we thank you. And so the Prime Minister and I are agreed that we should have that First Nations should have substantial equity ownership position in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and we're keen to work with Ottawa to make sure that this happens. And this is one of the reasons that we've created the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We've also created the Indigenous Legal Defense Fund to give a fair voice share to the vast majority of Western Canadian First Nations who are in favor of responsible resource development, but too often have been crowded out and left aside when it comes to debates on energy and the environment. And so this is a fund that will help to bring the voice of pro-development nations into our courts, because they have a right to assert their right to economic development, to be partners in prosperity, to move their people from poverty to prosperity. I would say it is somewhat ironic that governments and energy companies alike are finally embracing First Nations co-ownership of resource industries at a time when those industries are facing dramatic challenges and sustained attacks at both at home and abroad. But if we are going to ensure a prosperous future for Indigenous Canadians as co-owners and co-creators of resource wealth, we must ensure a vibrant future for those energy and resource industries in the first place. In order to do that, we need to take our second path of reconciliation, and that is reconciliation between energy development and the environment, especially in dealing with the challenge of greenhouse gas emissions and of climate change, which we Albertans take very seriously. Now, many people claim that there is no future for oil and gas, that building oil sands projects and pipelines is all pointless, is unsustainable, and that these all represent stranded assets. But enough about Mark Carney. I just had to throw that in. I'll be seeing him in London next month. But to those who doubt that we can lower our emissions and green the oil sands while still producing millions of barrels a day, you are underestimating Alberta's culture of innovation. It took decades of research and commitment from visionary leaders like Ernst Manning and Peter Lougheed, and huge scientific investments at our academic institutions, particularly the University of Alberta, to unlock the potential of our oil sands. But just as science was unlocking how to extract oil from bitumen, it was also realizing the unintended consequences of centuries of fossil fuel combustion, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. And this is what has led to groups like 350.org and others to call for leaving it in the ground, and for European financial institutions like HSBC, Zurich, and AXA, Munich RE, and others to refuse to underwrite or invest in oil sands projects. I must add, as an aside, all the while they are quite happy to provide financial services to the facilitation of OPEC oil. The challenge for us today, though, is to ensure that the oil sands are not only one of the largest petroleum reserves in the world, with a notional market value of $15 to $20 trillion, but that with technology, they can also become one of the cleanest. The question is how best to do it. And our vision is that we target specific sources of greenhouse gases and work with a combination of policy, technology, and market-based industry solutions to reduce those emissions. Alberta actually pioneered this approach as far back as 2007. And just 2 weeks ago, our government introduced legislation to further strengthen our levy on major industrial emitters through the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program, or TIER program. This plan sets a clear market signal to reduce carbon and the revenue generated and TIER will also help to finance new technologies that will achieve even more reductions. Finding solutions that lower GHGs while generating economic value will ultimately be the key to solving the climate challenge that we cannot ignore. But we will not only lower GHGs from oil sands operations, we will also take back the carbon dioxide that is released through carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which, as I think most people acknowledge, is now reaching a point of efficiency where it is scalable. Using carbon levies from the TIER fund, we intend to help bring some of these next horizon technologies to market. And we will work to get our natural gas as well to developing markets to displace emissions there and get credit for it here using Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we will insist that the national government acknowledge that the single greatest way that Canada could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions would be to export our liquefied natural gas resources to developing markets to help them in the global conversion from coal to gas. And we will not relent until there is recognition of this enormous potential that we have both to prosper and reduce emissions worldwide. This is the emerging vision of Alberta's industry and of Alberta's government. It is the path to reconciliation between energy and the environment. But for us to succeed, we'll need a federal government in Ottawa that is a true partner in our development and not a roadblock to it. This brings me to the third path of reconciliation that I'd like to talk about. Reconciliation between the centralizing tendencies of the Ottawa government and the right of provinces to have control over our future comme maître chez nous. This weekend, I outlined a number of ways by which Alberta could assert a larger role within the Federation. Don't worry, I won't repeat myself. It was a Castro-length speech, an hour and 10 minutes on Saturday. In fact, my friend Ted Morton said at the 45-minute mark, he thought he saw Fidel Castro climbing out of his grave to stretch his legs. So I won't repeat that. But the essence is this. We need a fair deal that respects the Constitution and gets Ottawa out of our way so that we can do what we do best, grow our economy, get our people back to work, and generate an oversized share of Canada's wealth. Nothing that we are asking for is unreasonable. Some of our demands, like a guarantee to build TMX by a firm fixed date, an equalization rebate that recognizes that we've been shortchanged at least nearly $2 billion by an arbitrary cap on the so-called fiscal stabilization program, equivalency agreements on our methane and carbon regulations, fast tracking of energy projects to get people to work, and support to get Albertans back to work on oil well reclamation, which can also help the environment. These things could be done tomorrow if Prime Minister Trudeau means what he said on election night about being there for people in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Other proposals are well within our control, like opening offices, as we will now do in Ottawa, Quebec, and British Columbia, to defend and articulate Alberta's interests, which we believe are also the national interest. Finally, other ideas like creating an Alberta pension plan or collecting our own taxes, well, they require more study, which is why we've created a fair deal panel of distinguished Albertans to consult widely across the province and report back to the government next spring with their recommendations. Where there is a good case for change, we'll seek a democratic mandate by having them endorsed by Albertans in a referendum before proceeding with any changes. And at the end of this process, our goal is to win a bigger voice and a fairer deal for Alberta within Canada. A fair deal, a reasonable deal, a workable deal, one that I believe Peter Lougheed would recognize in the spirit of his own negotiations with Ottawa 35 years ago. And let me pause to say that for those who characterize our press for fairness as a kind of provincialist, parochial, introverted push, they completely misunderstand the Alberta spirit. I believe that in their heart of hearts, the vast majority of Albertans are patriotic Canadians. It is a tragedy that a growing number of our fellow citizens see themselves as not being fully at home in their country, a country which they have dutifully served and to which they have contributed disproportionately. And I further believe that we Albertans are big Canadians. We believe in the original vision of the Constitution as an economic union. In fact, at the Council of the Federation meeting with other premiers this summer, I argued more than any of my colleagues in defense of the legitimate exercise of the federal power as originally conceived in the Constitution to ensure free trade, full labor mobility within Canada, and the federal paramountcy over interprovincial infrastructure like the power under Section 92 that built the Canadian Pacific Railway that united our country in the first place, and the power that should be used to ensure the construction of energy resource corridors, including oil and gas pipelines. And I point out to our fellow Albertans every day that we should not feel isolated, that we do have allies from coast to coast, 9 of 10 provinces who supported our call for a rewrite of the Bill C-69. 9 of 10 provinces who endorsed our call for energy and resource corridors, including oil and gas pipelines. 2 Canadians by a margin of 2-1, including 2-1 in British Columbia, who support the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Albertans should not feel isolated. We actually stand very much at the center of the Federation. We simply call for a renewal of the original vision of the economic union of Canada. We will not be made to feel unwelcome in the Federation of which we have always been champions. And so, in closing, let me once again thank and recognize tonight's fantastic honorees, each of them great Canadians and Albertans. And I know at least 2. Elizabeth came from Prince Edward Island, Stockwell, grew up in Ed's home territory in the west side of Montreal. Dave, where were you born? Calgary. Oh, he's a Calgarian. And Don? Oh, so we got two native-born Albertans, 2 migrants to Alberta, a pretty typical cross-section of the people who have built this province. I look forward to working with them, with the Public Policy Forum, and with many of you to renew Alberta's place in the Canadian Federation and to pursue the path of reconciliation. reconciliation with Indigenous people, reconciliation of responsible resource development with the environmental challenges of our time, and reconciliation with the great Canadian Federation. Thank you very much.